An HOA tried to break one old man, but they didn't know who they were dealing with.
They trespassed. They fined him. They even sued him. Yet he never bent. It started with a fence and ended with a courtroom reckoning. They brought patrols, papers, and lawyers. He brought silence and won.
The fence he'd started, as most neighborhood disputes do, with something small. The kind of irritation people brush off the first time, maybe the second, until the pattern hardens into a thorn buried too deep to ignore. Our fence had always been sturdy, a tall stretch of wood and iron marking the edge of my grandfather's property. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't there to show off. It was there to separate what was ours from what was theirs. And that line mattered. The HOA, though, seemed to have a different view. They patrolled like it was their right, clipboards in hand, measuring tape dangling, eyes sharp for anything they could label a violation. They called it ensuring community standards. Grandpa called it harassment. At first, the patrols lingered outside. They paced the sidewalk, leaning close to the fence as though sniffing out invisible crimes. They craned their necks, peered over, scribbled notes about the length of grass or the shade of paint. On the barn, it was intrusive, but it stayed on their side until the day it didn't. I remember the first time it happened. I was stacking firewood near the shed when I heard the thump, a shoe hitting wood, then the creak of weight settling on the top rail of the fence. I turned, and there he was, an HOA patrolman, bright vest reflecting in the sun, hauling himself over the fence like it was nothing more than a playground obstacle. His clipboard swung from his belt. As his boots hit our soil, he didn't even glance around to see if anyone was watching. He acted like he belonged. By the time I told Grandpa, the man was already gone, having wandered back out with notes scribbled about unapproved structures and possible code violations. But the look on Grandpa's face told me this wasn't over. His jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed, the way they always did when something crossed the line. Weeks passed, but the trespassing didn't stop. Different patrols came, sometimes men, sometimes women, all in those bright vests that shone like warnings. They climbed the fence without hesitation, stomped across the grass, and took their notes. Grandpa caught one in the act and told him to leave. The man sneered and said he was within his rights, part of his official duties. He walked off without another word, leaving Grandpa fuming on the porch. The rest of us tried to calm him. My mother said it wasn't worth a fight. My uncle suggested reporting it, but we all knew the HOA board would bury any complaint in a swamp of bureaucracy. That's how they thrived: paper, rules, intimidation. But Grandpa wasn't a man to bow to paper or intimidation. He was a man of action, of old ways, of lessons learned long before HOA letters existed. I started noticing changes after that. Tools pulled out of the shed, wire spools laid on the porch. Grandpa spent hours studying the gate, tracing the iron with his fingers, muttering to himself. At first, I didn't know what he was planning, but I could tell it was something he'd decided on deep down. The kind of decision you don't walk back from. The patrols didn't stop. If anything, they grew bolder. They climbed over even when Grandpa sat in plain view, as if daring him to do something about it. One left a violation notice nailed to our barn door claiming our woodpile was unsightly and demanding it be removed. Grandpa tore it down without a word, but the silence was heavy, like a storm cloud building. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon. Grandpa sat on the porch, rocking in his chair. When two patrols hopped the fence together, they strutted across the yard, pointing at the shed, writing notes, acting like inspectors of their own kingdom. Grandpa didn't move. He just watched, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. When they left, he rose from the chair and disappeared into the shed. That evening, the hum began, a low, steady buzz that rose from the metal gate when I brushed too close. Grandpa had wired it, carefully and deliberately. rigging it to deliver a shock to anyone foolish enough to climb where they didn't belong. It wasn't lethal, but it was enough to sting, enough to remind trespassers that boundaries meant something. From then on, the porch became Grandpa's watchtower. He sat there daily, hat pulled low, rifle propped beside him, not raised, not threatening, just present, a silent declaration that the fence was not a suggestion, and the land was not theirs to claim. The patrols noticed. At first, they circled the fence like vultures, hesitating before climbing. They muttered among themselves, watching Grandpa with wary eyes. One tried the gate and yelped when the current bit his fingers. He cursed, kicked the post, and stormed off. Word spread quickly after that. But HOA letters are nothing if not persistent. The board wasn't going to let one electrified gate stop them. They saw it as a challenge, a slap in the face, a threat to their authority, and authority was the lifeblood of their power. So while Grandpa rocked quietly on the porch, the HOA began planning their next move, and none of us realized just how far they were willing to go. Escalation. The electrified gate had drawn a line, sharper than any piece of paper or rule book could. For the first time in months, our yard felt defended, and the trespassers hesitated. Yet if anyone thought the HOA would retreat quietly, they didn't know how these people operated. They thrived on control, on bending neighbors into compliance, on setting examples of those who dared to resist. Within days, the rumors started. Neighbors whispered about Grandpa's dangerous setup. Word spread that he had created a hazard, that children could be harmed, that pets could be killed by the current running through the gate. It didn't matter that the voltage was too low for serious damage. It was enough to spark fear. Fear was a tool, and the HOA wielded it with precision. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, stamped with the HOA logo. They warned of unsafe modifications to community property and reckless endangerment. They painted Grandpa as a menace, an old man who couldn't be trusted with responsibility. It was propaganda, pure and simple. But it worked on some. Neighbors who once waved now averted their eyes. Others muttered disapproval when they passed, as though Grandpa's act of defense was a crime against the community. But the fence still stood, and the patrols no longer hopped it so casually. They circled like jackals, careful not to touch the gate, muttering among themselves. Sometimes they brought measuring devices, scanning from a distance, pretending to collect data. Sometimes they took photos, zooming in from the sidewalk as if gathering evidence for a trial. The air thickened with tension, and every day felt like waiting for a blow to land. Grandpa noticed. Of course, he always noticed. He didn't flinch. Beneath the stairs, he didn't rise when the cameras clicked. He simply rocked in his chair, rifle leaned against the wall, eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't performing for them. He wasn't threatening. He was simply there, unmoved, unyielding. And that, more than the electricity, infuriated them. The first real retaliation came in the form of a letter, thick envelope, official seal, addressed to the property owner. Inside, pages of legal jargon spilled accusations, violation of safety codes, alteration of common fencing, non-compliance with community standards, threats of fines, threats of liens, threats of legal action. They demanded immediate removal of the electrification and full cooperation with the HOA patrols. Grandpa read the letter once, folded it neatly, and set it aside. He didn't tear it up. He didn't curse or slam the table. He simply let it sit there, ignored, like a gnat buzzing at the edge of his vision. To him, words on paper carried no weight against the soil beneath his boots and the rifle by his chair. But to the HOA, his silence was gasoline on a fire. They escalated again. Patrols began arriving in pairs, clipboards ready, cameras flashing. They filmed the gate, zoomed in on the wires, documented Grandpa on the porch. They shouted notes to one another, trying to provoke a reaction, to capture evidence of aggression. But Grandpa never moved. He sat steady, a stone in the stream, watching as their frustration mounted. Then, one evening, they pushed further. Two patrolmen climbed the fence together, careful to avoid the electrified gate. They landed on our side, boots sinking into our grass, and began their inspection with deliberate arrogance. They measured, photographed, scribbled furiously. They walked straight toward the shed, muttering about violations and safety hazards. From the porch, Grandpa rose slowly. The rifle came to his shoulder, not fired, not even aimed directly, but held in readiness. The patrolmen froze. For a long moment, the air held its breath. Then, muttering curses, they retreated, clambering back over the fence with more haste than dignity. Word of that encounter spread faster than any letter or flyer. By morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some whispered in admiration, quietly cheering Grandpa's defiance. Others gasped in outrage, claiming he had threatened unarmed officials. The HOA seized the moment, calling an emergency board meeting, promising swift action against a dangerous homeowner endangering the peace of the community. But Grandpa didn't attend their meeting. He didn't sign their letters. He didn't answer their knocks at the door. He simply reinforced the wiring, checked the charge, and sat back on the porch. The message was clear. He would not bend. The HOA, though, wasn't finished. Their authority was at stake, and authority was something they guarded with claws and teeth. They began recruiting allies, pulling neighbors into their orbit with promises of safety and order. They painted Grandpa as a reckless outlaw, a relic of another time who refused to adapt. They promised lawsuits, police involvement, even forced removal if he continued to resist. And beneath their threats, a darker plan brewed. Because if they couldn't scare Grandpa into compliance, they would try to break him. The first hint of it came late one night, when motion lights flared across the yard. Footsteps crunched in the dark. By the time I reached the window, I saw the figures retreating into the shadows, their reflective vests catching the light. The gate wires hummed softly, untouched but tested. Someone had come to probe the defenses, to see if Grandpa was still awake. He was, sitting on the porch, hat low, rifle across his lap. He hadn't moved. He hadn't needed to. The lights had done the work for him. The trespassers slipped away into the dark, and Grandpa never even stood. But the message was clear. The HOA had escalated from paperwork to prowling in the night, and if they were willing to test the fence under cover of darkness, what would they try next? The storm was building, and everyone on both sides knew it. The confrontation be the time the sun rose over the neighborhood that Saturday morning. The HOA had decided to make its move. Their board members didn't arrive quietly. They wanted a spectacle, and they got one. 3 SUVs pulled up in front of our property, all polished to a mirror shine, as if authority gleamed brighter with a waxed coat. Out spilled the board president, to patrol captains, and half a dozen others carrying clipboards, cameras, and bright orange cones. Their uniforms weren't police-issued, but they carried themselves like soldiers marching into battle. Neighbors gathered quickly, drawn by the sight of the convoy. Lawns filled with onlookers, kids perched on bikes, couples whispering behind coffee mugs. It was theater, and everyone knew it. The HOA wanted witnesses. They wanted a crowd to see them reclaim their authority, to watch the old man on the porch bend beneath their will. But Grandpa didn't bend. He was there before they even arrived, rocking in his chair, hat shading his eyes, rifle resting in its usual place. The electrified gate hummed softly, the wire glinting in the morning sun. Every piece of the yard carried the weight of preparation. Grandpa hadn't just defended his land. He had turned it into a fortress of patience. The HOA marched forward, cones in hand, planting them at the sidewalk's edge like they were marking territory. They unfurled papers, waved them high, shouted legal jargon for the crowd's benefit. They spoke of codes, ordinances, safety hazards, and violations. They gestured toward the gate, toward the wires, toward Grandpa himself. They wanted the audience to believe he was a criminal in their midst, a danger that had to be neutralized. But no matter how loud they spoke, Grandpa's silence drowned them out. His calmness unsettled them, made their bluster sound like children throwing tantrums. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply sat, watching, as if daring them to cross the line. And then they did. Two patrol captains climbed the fence again, cameras rolling, hands gesturing as though performing for a judge. They dropped into our yard, boots landing heavily, and began their so-called inspection. They measured the current with handheld devices, poked at the wires, took close-up shots of the posts. They shouted notes back to their colleagues, narrating every step. trying to prove their authority extended past the boundary. The crowd murmured, restless. Some gasped, some whispered in awe, some muttered disapproval at the arrogance of the patrols. But everyone watched Dot, and Grandpa finally stood. Dot, it wasn't sudden, wasn't violent. He rose slowly, every motion deliberate, as though time itself bent to his pace. He took the rifle in hand, not raised to fire, not even aimed. He held it across his chest, barrel pointed toward the ground, yet the meaning was unmistakable. The patrolmen froze mid-step. The crowd silenced. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Grandpa spoke no words, but his stance said everything. The fence was a boundary, the gate was a warning, and his presence was the law here, older and stronger than any piece of paper waved. On the sidewalk, the patrols faltered. Cameras shook. One of them muttered something about safety, another about trespassing, but their bravado cracked. They glanced back toward their board president, who gestured wildly, urging them to continue. But hesitation had already taken root. Authority on paper could not match the sight of a man who refused to move. After a tense pause, they began retreating, step by step, slower than they came, until they scrambled back over the fence, their dignity left behind in the grass. The crowd erupted not in cheers or boos, but in whispers that spread like wildfire. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others nodded in quiet respect, but none could deny what they had witnessed. The HOA had come to stage a public victory. Instead, they had revealed their weakness. But defeat only sharpened their anger. The board president stormed forward, shouting accusations at the top of her lungs. She called Grandpa reckless, dangerous, unfit to live in a civilized community. She waved her stack of papers like weapons, promising fines, lawsuits, even arrest. She gestured toward the neighbors, urging them to see reason, to demand that Grandpa fall in line. Yet the neighbors didn't rally to her side. Some turned away, unwilling to be dragged further into the feud. Others muttered their support for Grandpa under their breath, and a few, emboldened by the scene, began questioning why the HOA was trespassing in the first place. The crowd wasn't united behind the board anymore. Cracks had formed. The board president noticed. Her voice grew shriller. Her hands shook as she waved the papers. Her threats rang hollow. The more she spoke, the less control she seemed to have. The spectacle meant to prove dominance had instead exposed desperation. Finally, with no victory to claim, the SUVs departed in a storm of exhaust fumes and slammed doors. The cones were left behind, scattered like abandoned toys. The neighbors dispersed slowly, whispering, casting glances back at the porch where Grandpa stood. He said nothing, did nothing, simply watched as the theater ended. But though the HOA had retreated, no one mistook this for the end. If anything, it was only the beginning. The confrontation had raised the stakes, and everyone knew what came next. The HOA would not forget the humiliation. They would not forgive the defiance. They would regroup, rearm with new tactics, and come back stronger. That night, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Some feared police involvement. Others worried about lawsuits. A few wondered if violence would erupt, and through it all, Grandpa remained steady. He reinforced the wires again, checked the charge, and returned to his chair. The porch light glowed faintly in the dark, a beacon of defiance. And though silence filled the yard, it was not peace. It was the pause before the storm. The authorities. Stephenth Board's retreat had not been a surrender, it was a regrouping. Behind the polished doors of their SUVs, they carried humiliation like a wound that refused to close. They had expected a quick show of dominance, a moment where they would parade their power before the neighborhood. Instead, they had been reduced to trespassers retreating under the gaze of a silent old man and his humming gate, and humiliation in the world of the HOA was never left unanswered. By the following week, the board escalated. They called the county inspector, the sheriff's office, and even the fire department, reporting Grandpa's gate as a hazard. They didn't mention their own trespass, their climbing of fences, or their invasion of property. Instead, they painted a picture of reckless endangerment, a rogue homeowner electrifying a gate in a suburban neighborhood, threatening children, pets, and delivery drivers. They built their case with selective words, polishing the story until it gleamed like a dagger. meant to pierce the sheriff's patience. The knock came on a Wednesday afternoon. Sheriff's deputies, dressed in tan uniforms and mirrored sunglasses, pulled up in official cruisers. Their presence was different from the HOA's pageantry. There was no bluster here, no waving of clipboards. Authority here was quieter, heavier. The deputies approached the porch carefully, aware of who they were dealing with. They had heard the stories, they had read the reports, and now they were standing face to face with the man at the center of the storm. Grandpa didn't rise to meet them. He sat in his chair as always, rifle propped across his lap, not pointed, not threatening, but visible. The deputies kept their distance, hands resting near their belts, voices even but firm. They explained why they were there, what had been reported, and what they needed to see. The gate buzzed faintly behind them, the wires glinting in the sunlight. Grandpa listened. He didn't interrupt. He let them finish every word, every accusation, every explanation. And then he motioned slowly, deliberately toward the fence line. He didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't tell his side of the story. He simply gestured, inviting them to look for themselves. The deputies did. They examined the gate, checked the wiring, measured the current. They saw the signs posted clearly: private property, do not enter, warning, electric fence. They noted how the wires were positioned high enough to deter climbers, low enough to avoid casual contact. They tested the voltage and saw it was strong enough to sting, to warn, but not lethal. It was, in fact, within legal limits for livestock. Fencing, the same laws that applied to farms and ranches just outside city limits. It wasn't dangerous, it was deterrence. The deputies returned to the porch, and their tone had changed. They weren't here to arrest. They weren't here to dismantle anything. They were here to verify, to check boxes, to ensure that the reports matched reality. And reality, as they now saw, was far different from the HOA's narrative. They gave Grandpa their conclusions plainly. He was within his rights. The gate was legal. The warnings were clear. There was no violation to enforce. And with that, they tipped their hats, offered a final word of caution, and departed. The HOA, watching from across the street with phones raised like vultures, was left gaping. Their theater had failed again. The sheriff's office had not dragged Grandpa away in handcuffs. They had not cut the wires, not fined him, not even scolded him. They had left him sitting on his porch, rifle across his lap, gate humming at his back. But the HOA wasn't finished. If law enforcement wouldn't bend to their story, then they would escalate further. They drafted letters, filed complaints with the county board, contacted zoning officials, even hinted at federal violations. Each rejection only hardened their resolve. Each failure only deepened their desperation. And still, Grandpa didn't flinch. He carried on with his days as if the storm swirling outside his gate was no more than background noise. He tended his small garden, repaired tools in the shed, fed the stray dog that had taken to sleeping near the porch steps. His life was steady, unshaken, a calm center in a neighborhood spiraling into conflict. But the calmness only enraged the board more. To them, his silence was mockery. His stillness was defiance. Every day he sat on that porch, rifle in lap, was another day. They looked weaker, and so they began to talk not of codes or ordinances, but of control. If the law would not bend, they would find ways to twist it. If neighbors would not rally, they would pressure them. Fines appeared in mailboxes, not just for Grandpa but for anyone who dared show sympathy. Notices of violations appeared for trivial things: grass too long by half an inch, paint not the right shade, trash cans left out too long. The HOA began to rule by fear, punishing the neighborhood for its lack of obedience. But fear is a poor foundation for loyalty, and the more they tightened their grip, the more the cracks widened. Neighbors whispered in private about resistance, about pushing back, about standing with the old man who had dared to do what they could not. Grandpa had become a symbol of defiance, of resilience, of a boundary no HOA could cross. The sheriff's visit had not ended the conflict. It had transformed it. The HOA had learned that force would not win, that law could not be bent so easily. But instead of stopping, they shifted tactics. They would play a longer game now, one of attrition, paperwork, and endless pressure. The neighborhood felt it. The tension hung heavy in the air. Every walk down the street was marked by sideways glances, hushed conversations, and the constant hum of the gate reminding everyone that one man had chosen to fight back. And though Grandpa still rocked in his chair, still watched from the porch, there was a new weight in his silence. He knew the board wouldn't stop. He knew they were gathering strength in the shadows of bureaucracy. And he knew that the storm had not yet reached its peak. The paper-worthy sheriff's visit should have been the end. Any reasonable board would have taken the deputy's words as final, accepted that the gate was legal, and moved on. But this board wasn't reasonable. They weren't after safety nor order. What they wanted was compliance, and Grandpa's refusal to bend had become a wound they couldn't stop picking when force failed. They turned to the quieter weapon of bureaucracy. It began with letters, not just one or two, but a steady stream delivered to Grandpa's mailbox. Each envelope bore the same logo, HOA Property Management, printed in neat, corporate lettering. Each carried a different accusation, a different threat, a different demand. The paint on the porch railing was chipped. The shed in the back exceeded allowable dimensions. The grass near the mailbox grew 1 inch higher than community standards permitted. The font, the tone, the repetition, it was death by paperwork. Every letter carried the same consequence: fines. Small at first, then larger, stacking on top of one another like bricks in a wall meant to crush. $200 for the railing, $500 for the shed, $1,000 for unapproved fencing modifications. The numbers climbed with every page, and the board made sure to remind him that unpaid fines could be converted into liens against the property. Their goal was clear: if they couldn't beat him outright, they would bury him in debt until the land itself slipped from his hands. Grandpa didn't respond, not to the first letter, nor the 10th, nor the 50th. He stacked them neatly in a box inside the house, each one unopened, but carefully kept. He knew better than to play their game. Every reply, every appeal, every acknowledgement was another thread in the web they wanted to weave around him. Silence was his shield. But silence came with a cost. The board widened their reach. Notices appeared on neighbors' doors, warning that non-cooperation within the community could result in collective penalties. Rumors spread, seated by board members whispering at block meetings, that Grandpa's gate was endangering property values. Some neighbors, fearful of losing their investments, began to shift uneasily, torn between sympathy for the old man and loyalty to their wallets. Others, however, saw through the theater. They watched the board's obsession grow, watched the letters pile up, and quietly began to side with Grandpa. A few slipped notes into his mailbox offering words of encouragement. A handful brought groceries to his porch or left tools and supplies at his gate. They couldn't say it out loud, not with the board watching, but they admired the old man's resolve. The HOA responded with more pressure. They raised dues. They threatened collective lawsuits. They called emergency meetings filled with speeches about order, unity, and the dangers of rogue elements. Yet every meeting ended with the same bitter taste. They were at war with one man. And despite their money, their lawyers, and their threats, he wasn't losing. And so they escalated. Again. One morning, a process server appeared at the gate. He didn't climb the fence, didn't risk the wires. He stood carefully at the boundary, holding a manila envelope aloft. Within it was the culmination of months of paperwork, a lawsuit filed in civil court. The HOA was suing Grandpa for willful violations of community bylaws, endangerment of residents, and refusal to comply with corrective directives. The fine print ran for dozens of pages, each paragraph carefully crafted by the board's lawyers. It was the strike they had been building toward. Not just fines, not just letters. This was an attempt to use the courts to pry the land from his hands. Grandpa didn't flinch. He accepted the envelope, set it aside, and went back to his chair. But while his face remained calm, the weight of the board's attack pressed heavier than before. This wasn't just harassment now. This was a battle for ownership. Weeks passed, and the case moved forward. Court dates were set. Neighbors whispered about outcomes. Some predicted the old man would lose everything, that the HOA's lawyers were too well-funded to be beaten. Others believed he had a plan, that his silence was more than stubbornness, and Then something shifted. It began when neighbors noticed Grandpa making trips into town, carrying folders instead of tools. He spent hours at the county courthouse, at the recorder's office, at the library archives. He asked quiet questions, pulled dusty files, and filled notebooks with scribbled notes. For the first time since the conflict began, he was moving, not reacting, but preparing. What the board didn't know was that Grandpa's silence hadn't been surrender. It had been patience. He had been stacking their letters not out of neglect, but out of strategy. Every unopened envelope was evidence. Every fine, every notice, every petty accusation was a record of their harassment, their obsession, their abuse of authority. And he wasn't just collecting, he was countering. The lawsuit was meant to trap him, but it had given him a platform. A courtroom wasn't just a place for lawyers to speak, it was a place for the truth to be revealed. And Grandpa, with his box of letters and his folders of research, was ready to show the pattern the board had tried to hide. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. The board, confident in their lawyers, strutted with renewed arrogance. Grandpa, calm as ever, rocked in his chair, watching the gate hum. The stage was set, not for a quiet surrender, but for a showdown that would decide more than just one man's property. Because by now, the fight had grown larger than the gate, larger than the land. It had become a symbol for everyone watching, a question of whether an HOA's power was limitless, or whether one man could draw a line and hold it. And as the court date approached, the neighborhood waited with bated breath. Judgment Day Courthouse was not a place Grandpa visited often. Its polished floors and high ceilings carried the smell of varnish and cold authority, a world far removed from the dirt and wood of his porch. Yet when the day arrived, he walked through its doors with the same steady pace he used when tending to his land. No rush, no nerves, just purpose. The HOA board arrived in a caravan. Their lawyers carried briefcases, their members wore pressed suits, and their self-appointed leader strutted at the front with a smug smile. They believed the outcome was inevitable. The law, they thought, was just another fence they controlled, another system bent to their favor. Neighbors filtered into the gallery. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet support. A few bored loyalists sat near the front, whispering in sharp tones. But most kept their eyes on the man at the center, the old figure who had fought them from a rocking chair and a gate. For months, they had seen him resist. Now they would see if he could win. The case began with the board's accusations. Their lawyers spoke at length about community standards, about rules and regulations, about how one man's defiance threatened order. They showed photographs of the gate, the wires, the warning signs. They painted Grandpa as a danger, a stubborn relic unwilling to follow the rules everyone else respected. Their words flowed like a river of rehearsed indignation, crafted to overwhelm with polish and precision. But as their arguments grew longer, something else became clear. The more they spoke, the more they revealed the depth of their obsession. They weren't talking about safety, or community, or even property values. They were talking about control. Each accusation carried the tone of personal vendetta, each point dripping with the bitterness of pride wounded by defiance. When it was Grandpa's turn, the room shifted. He didn't bring a lawyer. Instead, he carried with him the box, the same box that had sat in his home for months, quietly filling with every unopened envelope the board had sent. He set it down on the table with a weight that echoed in the silence. Piece by piece, he laid out the letters, not one or two, but dozens upon dozens, each stamped with the board's logo, each carrying another demand, another fine, another attempt to break him. He spread them across the table until the paper spilled like floodwater, drowning the board's polished narrative under the sheer weight of their persistence. The judge sifted through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every notice. What was supposed to look like order instead looked like obsession. What was supposed to be regulation looked like harassment. The board's own evidence, preserved in the letters they had proudly sent, now betrayed them. And then Grandpa revealed the second part of his preparation. From his folders came documents, yellowed with age but stamped with official seals, county records, property maps, land surveys predating the HOA itself. They showed that his land, his gate, his fence, all of it stood outside the jurisdiction the board claimed. The HOA had no right to regulate his property at all. They had built their entire case on authority they never truly possessed. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Neighbors who had doubted now leaned forward in astonishment. Those who had secretly cheered felt vindication surge in their chests. Even some who had sided with the board lowered their eyes, ashamed to see the truth laid bare. The board's lawyers stammered. Their leader flushed red, her confidence cracking into outrage. They tried to recover, tried to pivot, but the momentum was gone. The judge's expression had hardened, his patience thinning with every failed argument. It was no longer a case of one man defying rules. It was a case of a board abusing power, stretching beyond its reach, and harassing a resident for sport. When the ruling came, it was decisive. The fines were voided, the lawsuit dismissed. The HOA was ordered to cease all enforcement against Grandpa's property and to cover his legal costs, even though he had not hired a lawyer. The judge's words cut through the courtroom like lightning. The board had acted outside its authority, and their behavior had crossed the line into harassment. The gallery erupted not with cheers, but with the kind of electric energy that comes when a truth long hidden finally breaks into the open. Neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding silently toward Grandpa, others shaking their heads at the board they had once trusted. Grandpa simply gathered his papers, slid them back into the box, and walked out as calmly as he had entered. No speeches, no gloating, just the steady steps of a man who had fought his battle and won. The aftermath rippled through the community. The board's credibility collapsed overnight. Members resigned, some in shame, others in fear of further consequences. Those who remained scrambled to repair their image, but the damage was done. Their power had been exposed for what it was: fragile, inflated, dependent on intimidation rather than respect. Neighbors began to speak more freely. Stories surfaced of other small abuses, other acts of overreach the board had committed in silence. With Grandpa's victory as proof, more residents began to push back, to demand change, to remind the board that they were servants, not rulers. And as for Grandpa, life returned to its quiet rhythm. The porch remained his watchtower, the rocking chair his throne. The gate still hummed softly with its silent warning, a line drawn not just in metal and wire, but in principle. From his seat, he watched the seasons turn, the land stretch out before him, the sky shift from gold to gray to blue again. And though he rarely spoke of the battle, everyone in the neighborhood knew its story. It passed from porch to porch, from whispered conversations to knowing nods. It became a kind of legend, not of rebellion for its own sake, but of resistance against the creeping reach of power that forgot its limits. The board had sent their patrols. They had climbed his fence. They had written their letters and filed their lawsuits. But in the end, they had been broken not by force, but by the patience of one old man who refused to bend. And so the porch remained, the gate stood tall, and Grandpa rocked quietly in the fading light, content to know that the land was still his and that the line he had drawn would hold.